talk this morning about risk, need, and responsivity, and what's in it for you, why bother thinking about these principles. I'm going to start by providing a brief overview of R&R, and then we'll talk about how R&R and drug courts have worked together or not, and how I think that understanding these principles, applying these principles, can help to improve their outcomes and their effectiveness, and then apply that more generally to community courts. Oh. All right. So how many of you are familiar with the principles of risk, need, and responsivity? Okay. At this point, I feel like it's a little bit of a buzzword. People talk about R&R, they kind of throw it around, but I'm not always sure that people understand exactly what that means. And so, still hearing feedback. So I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about that. When we talk about the risk principle, right, which is the first principle of effective interventions. The risk principle essentially says that we need to make sure we're targeting higher risk individuals with more intensive services, and that we need to do less for those that are lower risk. When I talk about risk, I'm specifically talking about risk to reoffend, risk to recidivate. Right? And so what this means is we need to know someone's likelihood of getting into trouble again and then match services accordingly. The risk principle says if we violate this, if we put low-risk people into overly intensive services, we do too much for them, we actually can cause harm. We see that recidivism rates tend to go up. Right? Conversely, if we don't provide sufficient services to higher-risk people, we're not likely to change their behavior, which means recidivism rates are expected to stay about the same. Either case, that's not such a good thing. So the risk principle is really about telling us who we should be targeting for our interventions, for supervision, for services. The needs principle tells us what we should be targeting, right? If our goal is to reduce recidivism, then it's important that we're targeting factors that drive recidivism, that we target those factors that predict that someone's going to get into trouble again. And so this includes things like criminal thinking, having attitudes that are supportive of criminal behavior. It includes things like drug use, education and employment, personality characteristics like low self-control or impulsivity, and criminal peer networks. If we want to change people's behavior, we need to change those factors that predict that behavior. So the risk principle is telling us who to target, the needs principle is telling us what to target, and the responsivity principle then tells us how to go about providing these interventions. When we talk about responsivity, we can talk about either general responsivity or specific responsivity. General responsivity really has to do with the type of treatment that we're providing. The research tells us, and this is true across a lot of different types of behaviors, that if we want to change behavior, we should be using a cognitive behavioral or behavioral approach to treatment. What this means is that we provide interventions that are very structured, they're very present focused, they're focused on what's happening here and now. They're very action-oriented, right? So when we talk about doing role plays, that's part of a good behavioral program. We're teaching people skills, we're having them practice those skills, and then hopefully apply those skills in the community. We focus on restructuring their thinking, right? If someone has thoughts that support criminal behavior, that support drug use, right? Oh, I can have just one. Everyone's doing it. We want to change that thinking for people. And so a good cognitive behavioral program is going to focus on changing those criminal thoughts, helping people to recognize their risky situations, their risky people, places, and things, and teaching them skills for managing those situations. When we talk about responsivity, we also have what we call specific responsivity. And specific responsivity is really about the individual differences that we all have and things that may make us more or less successful in treatment. The individuals that you work with, how many of them are motivated to change their behavior? A handful? Right? A lot of times when I ask, what do you need help with? The answer is, no, I don't need help. You're the problem. Right? Motivation is a responsivity factor. We know people can be successful in treatment even if they're not motivated, but we know that people are much more successful if they are motivated. And so we can use techniques. We can assess people's level of motivation, and then we can use techniques like motivational interviewing, cost-benefit analyses, functional analyses to enhance that level of motivation. And in doing so, we start to remove that barrier to success. And if we can get them to complete treatment, complete the programs, then they're more likely to be successful when they're off supervision. So risk is telling us who to target, need is telling us what to target, and responsivity is telling us how to go about doing this. Use a behavioral or cognitive behavioral intervention and remove those barriers that get in people's way of completing treatment. And then we have the fidelity principle. Research tells us that even the best designed programs can go terribly wrong, right? The fidelity principle is saying we need to pay attention to how we're delivering services. Are we doing things the way we intend to? Are we delivering our services with integrity, with fidelity? And so monitoring, collecting data, observing groups, auditing assessments, monitoring and evaluating the services being provided help to ensure that they're being delivered with integrity. And this becomes really important because there are studies showing that when we fail to deliver services with integrity, that recidivism goes up. If you're familiar with aggression replacement training or functional family therapy, those are two well-supported programs, right? The evidence is very consistent that those programs can change recidivism. They improve outcomes. And yet, a study done by Robert Bernowski up in Washington State found that when those curricula were delivered without competence, right, they were delivered poorly, recidivism rates went up. People that participated in those groups where it was delivered poorly did worse than people that didn't go to group at all. So we need to be attentive to who, what, and how in terms of the services that we're providing, but we also need to be attentive to whether or not we're actually doing what we think we're doing. And that's what the fidelity principle is telling us. I think you're probably talking a bit more about issues around fidelity and integrity over some of the other sessions as I was looking through the agenda. We're going to focus specifically on risk, need, and responsivity for this session. So, I'm assuming you've all heard of drug courts, right? So as you know, I'm assuming you know, drug court started back in 1989. It's been almost 30 years of the drug court model. And they were originally intended to divert drug offenders from prison, right? There were a lot of people cycling back and forth between the community and prison. They weren't getting treatment in prison. They got out, they reoffended, they went back. And so the early drug court model was really about breaking that cycle. And it was believed that if we brought together the courts, probation, and treatment, that we could provide a collaborative approach to supervision and treatment, we could keep people in the community and keep our communities safe, and provide the necessary services. Obviously, it's been a successful model, right? It has served as the basis for domestic violence courts, mental health courts, family courts, a whole host of other types of problem-solving courts. And I've been doing research on drug courts since the late 90s, and it's really fascinating to kind of see how they've changed and grown and emerged over time. So the question is, are drug courts effective? And of course, yes. Right? That's why they've endured. That's why we've seen so many replications of the model. But I would argue they're not that effective. The meta-analyses, including my own work, find that drug courts on average reduce recidivism between 9 and 12%, Recidivism being measured as a new drug offense, a new arrest, a whole variety of ways. But on average, about 9 to 12% reductions in recidivism. I would argue that's not enough. It's significant, it's meaningful, but we should be doing better. And so research more recently, my colleagues, myself, is really looking at how do we improve drug courts? Who should they be serving? What should they be doing? How should they be operating? And I believe that we can use the R&R model of intervention as a framework for improving drug courts, and by extension, community courts. So I want to talk a little bit about how drug courts are or are not adhering to these principles of risk, need, and responsivity. And we'll start with the risk principle. The risk principle, remember, says that we need to match higher risk individuals to more intensive services and do less for those that are lower risk. And yet, many of our drug courts tend to serve lower risk people. This is changing, or it should be, but I just heard this is true, right? There are many reasons that we select the lower risk. Sometimes it's for political reasons. Sometimes it's because, you feel like you can make a difference with them. But what we know is that as long as we're targeting those lower risk people with this intensive model, we're likely to do harm. We're net widening, we're bringing people into a more intensive system than they need to, which means there's not space for the people that really need it, right? They're more likely to violate, recidivism rates go up. This is not our goal. This is not what we should be doing. When we have political pressures, when the reality is we've got to bring these low-risk people in, and some low-risk people have pretty serious substance use needs or substance use problems, we should at least be developing separate tracks that are less intensive. We should not treat all individuals the same when they have different risk levels. Ideally, we should be reserving drug courts for the higher end, but if you have to bring the low end in, at least treat them differently. These are results from a drug court in Idaho. There's been a lot of research on drug courts up in Idaho, or at least, well, for the past 20 years, I guess. And these are results from a drug court looking at the effectiveness for moderate versus high-risk offenders, right? My colleagues and I did this study because in the state of Idaho, they did a statewide evaluation, and they found that people that scored over 34 on the LSIR were more likely to recidivate even when they were in a drug court. And it's sort of like, well, of course they are, right? If they're scoring higher risk, they are more likely to recidivate than people that score lower risk. Sort of common sense. But the concern for me and my colleagues became, what if they start to systematically exclude those higher risk individuals? And so we took a look at the data. These two bars show the effects, right, of comparing high-risk drug court participants to high-risk probationers and moderate-risk drug court participants to moderate-risk probationers. I'll be honest, the high-risk drug court participants had higher rates of recidivism than the moderate risk, right? But they recidivated significantly less than their high-risk probation counterparts, and they recidivated less than moderate-risk probationers. So when we start talking about how we get the most bang for our buck, it's by focusing on the higher end individuals that we can make more of a difference with. I'm not saying we exclude the moderate risk, but what I'm suggesting is that you're going to have high-risk people in the community no matter what. And the best use of your resources is to bring those high-risk people into your more intensive programs, into your community courts, into drug courts, and in doing so, you can enjoy greater effects. You'll have more of an impact on recidivism. So that's the risk principle. The needs principle, remember, says that we need to target those factors that predict recidivism. Drug courts target substance abuse. as they should. That's who they're designed to serve, or drug offenders. But if we're targeting moderate to high risk individuals, we need to recognize that these people have a lot more needs than just substance abuse, right? They probably have some criminal thinking going on. They probably have some criminal friends. They might have poor employment histories or poor attitudes towards employment. They might struggle with self-control. Relapse prevention might be completely not even a thought for them. And so for our drug courts to be more effective, we need to look not just at substance use, but at the wider range of criminogenic needs. For my dissertation, I did a meta-analysis on drug courts, and because I was a little bit nuts, I also surveyed all of the drug courts that were in my sample. So I talked to 63 different drug courts to find out not just what their outcomes were, but what their practices were. And one of the questions that I asked them was, what do you target? What are the groups that you're providing? What are the groups that you're referring to? And as expected, everyone referred people to substance abuse treatment. It's a drug court. But look at the programs that talked about education or employment, right? A third, less than half. None of the programs that I talked to targeted antisocial attitudes or criminal thinking. None of them had groups aimed at disrupting peer networks. And yet we know that those factors are incredibly predictive of future criminal behavior. About a quarter dealt with the family, and 62% identified other needs. What are these other needs? These other needs fall into what we call non-criminogenic needs, factors that might be important, but they don't predict recidivism. Things like mental health. It's important. We want people to function well, right? We want people to be stable. But targeting mental health alone doesn't reduce recidivism. For a lot of our women's programs, we do things like creativity and art therapy, right? Play with some construction paper and glitter and you're all solved. I don't understand that thinking, right? Programs focus on physical activity, fear of official punishment, right? That threat, that deterrence approach, right? What we know is that emphasizing these or focusing on these in lieu of criminogenic needs brings effectiveness down. And in fact, a meta-analysis by Paul Gendreau and his colleagues that looked at a wider range of correctional interventions, so not just drug courts, right, but all types of treatment programs, found that programs that consistently emphasize criminogenic needs over non-criminogenic needs are significantly better. They can reduce recidivism 31% compared to those programs that emphasize non-criminogenic needs. Now, drug courts focus on substance abuse, so they're not in this camp. But what we want is to make sure that drug courts are not focusing just on substance abuse, but again, that bigger range of criminogenic needs. And that again holds true for all of the community courts. You need to be mindful of the factors that are predicting recidivism and think about how then you can address those and reduce those so that we're reducing the likelihood of recidivism. So we've got the who and the what. The next is the how. The story doesn't get much better, right? Sadly. So remember I said that a cognitive behavioral or behavioral approach is the most effective type of treatment, right? That's what we should be doing to gain the most change in terms of criminal behavior. And yet substance abuse treatment is historically based on a self-help disease model type of approach. That model is less effective. It can work for some people, but it's less effective. Right? We also know that programs are more effective when they, again, focus on specific responsivity factors, right? So enhancing motivation, addressing mental health, addressing trauma, removing those barriers. In some cases, it might be something as simple as transportation, right? I live in New York. That bus can take a long time to get you from point A to point B, depending on where you're going. And depending on where you're going, you might be going through some rival gang territory. That could be a responsivity factor for someone, right? How do I get there? And if I'm not motivated, and I have to take a 2-hour bus ride, and I'm going through a neighborhood that puts me at risk, I'm not sure I'm going to go. How are drug courts doing in terms of responsivity? When I asked the programs that participated in my survey about the type of treatment that they provided, less than a third said they use a cognitive behavioral approach. Over half said they use an eclectic approach, which means a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and a little bit of this. And that approach is not found to be as effective. It's not teaching people how to recognize their high-risk situations and how to manage them. It's not aimed at changing their thinking, at least not consistently. So when we think about the effects that drug courts have or not, I think this is one of the reasons that they're not doing better. More recently, my colleagues and I looked at 90 different evaluations of drug courts that had been completed, and we looked at whether or not there was any mention of responsivity, which we defined as mental health, motivation, and single-sex groups. Of these 90 drug courts, we found that almost half conduct some sort of assessment of mental health. Over 80% provide mental health services. So there's a little disconnect there on how they're knowing who needs these services. All of them identified motivation as a target, right? And less than a quarter varied their services by gender, right? This is a problem. When we put men and women, boys and girls, into the same treatment group, that group becomes less effective, particularly for women. Women tend to sit back, they take on the helping role, men become more machismo, juveniles, it becomes a whole dating thing, right? We need to have separate services. We need to allow people to focus on their change without the gender issues coming into play. Not to mention that the way, trauma impacts us, the way our friends influence our behaviors, who our negative influences are, those are all different experiences. And so drug courts are doing okay on some of these responsivity factors, but I would suggest again that they could be doing better. So when we think about the effectiveness of drug courts, the collaborative approach, the therapeutic approach to jurisprudence, the allowance for relapse, I think all of those factors help to explain their success. But when we think about why they're not more successful, I think it goes to the lack of planning, the ad hoc approach to the development of the model, and the failure to really use R&R as a framework for practice, particularly as it relates to treatment. In 2012, a couple of researchers up in Canada did yet another meta-analysis of drug courts. We're all doing them all the time, right? And they looked at whether or not drug courts were adhering to the principles of R&R. And so this 0, 1, 2 simply is the number of principles that drug courts adhered to. None of the drug courts in their sample followed all 3 principles, not a single one. And only about 32% of the drug courts in their sample did at least 2 of those. So when we talk about the who, what, and how, our drug courts historically are not doing such a great job of following those principles. Why does it matter? Because of this. These are results from a meta-analysis conducted by Andrews and Dowden back in 1999. There have been similar studies since then that replicate these findings, but I kind of like going back to the original. They looked at whether or not programs adhered to risk, need, and responsivity and how that related to their outcomes. And what they found is that programs that violated the risk principle on average increased recidivism, but when they followed it, they decreased recidivism on average about 18%. Programs that targeted criminogenic needs on average, reduced recidivism about 26%. When they failed to focus on criminogenic needs, they still reduced recidivism, but not as strongly, right? Only what, about 4%. And when they used when they adhered to responsivity, which here was defined as a behavioral or cognitive behavioral approach to treatment, they reduced recidivism on average about 26% compared to those that had about an 8% reduction that did not use a behavioral or cognitive behavioral approach. But here for me is the kicker. When they did all three of those things, they targeted higher risk people, they focused on criminogenic needs, and they used a behavioral or cognitive behavioral approach, they reduced recidivism 36% on average. That's huge. If we can reduce recidivism 36%, we're doing an amazing job. And yet, our drug courts aren't doing these things. So when we think about why drug courts are successful but not that successful, I would argue it's because they haven't fully adopted the R&R model. So what does this mean for community courts? Well, it means I think you need to be using the R&R model, right? And there are other factors that go into play, right? How do we work with the community? What are the legal issues that are involved? It's not just about treatment, but I think this is a part that often gets overlooked. And so when we think about how to apply R&R to a community court model, this means that we need to assess people for their level of risk, and we need to target higher end people. And when I say higher end, I really mean moderate and above. And that if you're going to focus on low risk, you absolutely have to develop separate tracks that are less intensive. We don't want to increase recidivism, and we especially don't want to spend resources while increasing recidivism. We don't have enough as it is. Resources, not recidivism, right? This means that community courts really need to be mindful of the need principle. When you think about who you're referring people to, or the types of services, rather, that you're referring people to, you need to focus on their criminogenic needs. This means you need to assess those needs. What are the factors that someone possesses that's driving their recidivism? We need to assess for them, we need to refer them to structured, deliberate interventions that target those factors, and we need to emphasize criminogenic needs over non-criminogenic needs. And then we need to be thoughtful about the type of treatment being provided. And I know I sound a little bit redundant, but I sort of feel like we need to say it again and again and again, because too often we're not doing these things, right? We need to make sure that we're using behavioral and cognitive behavioral approaches to treatment. So this means you need to work closely with your providers. You need to know the nature of the service that they're providing. You should go sit in on those groups, right? Don't just... And if there are providers in the room, I mean this in the most loving way, but don't just trust the providers, work with the providers, collaborate with the providers. Know what type of intervention is being given out to the people that you're working with. Because when it starts to fall away from this behavioral, cognitive behavioral approach, our programs become less effective. And I think that we have too much at stake to not use the most effective approaches. And then both internally and with your providers, you need to make sure that you're assessing for salient responsivity factors. Take a look at your population, identify who struggles, who's failing. What are the reasons for failure? And then make sure that you're systematically assessing for those factors up front. All too often, we don't think about responsivity until it's a problem. I don't worry about mental health until someone's exhibiting serious signs of mental health problems. That's not good enough. If this is an issue for your population, you should be screening for that, assessing for that up front so that you can make accommodations before it becomes a problem. I mentioned transportation earlier. I'm working with an agency in Iowa that has actually developed a transportation assessment. When someone first comes on probation, they ask, do you have a car? Do you have a license? Are you at risk of losing your license? And if they are, right, they don't have a car, they don't have reliable transportation. Do you know how the bus system works? Do you know what stops you need to use? Do you have bus tokens? Or a Metro card, depending on where no Metro cards in Iowa, right? Right? But it's a great way of getting out in front of that problem. We're taking the excuses away of not getting to treatment, not getting to group, not coming to probation, not coming for my contacts. Get rid of those problems before they become a problem. This is specific to your program though, right? Every community court, every jurisdiction is going to have different issues. So take a systematic look at who you're serving so that you can figure out what those responsivity factors are that matter for you. And of course, the theme running through all of this is the need for assessment, right? You can't make good decisions without good information. And as much as we all might like to believe in our, what I like to call our gut feeling index, it's not that effective. Research tells us that clinical judgments, personal judgments, are less effective than actuarial approaches, than standardized approaches to assessment. This means that as courts, you need to adopt assessments that tell you someone's risk level. Because how can you make sure you're getting in moderate to high risk people if you don't know their risk level? You need to assess for their needs. How do you know what their criminogenic needs are if you aren't assessing for it? And you need to know what their responsivity factors are, again, specific to your program. There are a lot of assessments out there, right? And I'm not going to say you should use this one or that one or that one. But I will say there are some general principles that you should be looking for if you're looking to adopt a risk-need assessment. One is that it should include the empirically supported predictors of criminal behavior. I come across new assessments all the time, and I can look to see at the factors that it's assessing and at least have some sense as to its validity just on that basis alone. If it's asking about things that doesn't predict criminal behavior, it's not likely to be very valid. You should adopt assessments that include both static and dynamic risk factors. Static factors are those things like criminal history, right? A history of unemployment, family criminal history, those things we can't change. We know that historical factors are good at predicting the future. But we also know that we need to know about those dynamic factors because those are the things that we can change. Knowing that someone had a drug problem in the past, that's good, that's informative. But knowing that they have a drug problem now provides me guidance then for treatment, provides me guidance for intervention, right? We know that they should use an actuarial approach, a scientific approach to assessment. The same way that when you buy car insurance, your agent asks you a lot of different questions, right? What type of car do you have? What's your zip code? Because they want to know how likely it is to be stolen. What's your driving record, right? Do you have history of speeding or not? How often have you been in accidents? And they take all that information and they calculate a probability that you're going to cost them money. And that then translates to your insurance rate. We want to use that same type of approach for assessing individuals and their risk of recidivism. Because again, our gut feeling isn't as predictive. It's not as precise. And even if one of you has like the absolute best gut feeling in the world, you can't train other people on that. Right? And then we know that we want to make sure that your assessments have multiple measures of each risk or each domain. You can't measure family with a single item. You can't measure substance use with a single item. And so if you're looking to adopt assessments, remember these basic principles in mind, and that'll help lead you towards adopting an assessment that should work for your community. This is a table I put together actually pretty recently. I'm working with a group in Central America. We're trying to see how R&R works in in Central America, which is challenging for a whole host of different reasons. And they said, yeah, we want to do one of these risk assessments. Tell us what to do. And I was like, no. I can help you. I can give you information about these tools, but I don't know your agency the way that you do. I can't tell you which tool to use. And so what I did is I pulled together this table. The ORAS, the COMPASS, the LSIR are probably 3 of the most commonly used risk-need assessments for adult populations. And I just went through. I did some Googling, I reached out to the publishers, and I got some information where I needed to fill in the blanks. Right? How long does it take to complete this assessment? What are the resources that are required, both in terms of time, but also in terms of actual cost? What type of training is required? Is there a computer required? The jurisdiction I'm working with doesn't have a lot of computers, so that wiped the COMPASS out of contention because it's only available on the computer. Is it available in Spanish? Because that was important for me. If you're looking to adopt an assessment, I encourage you to go through the same type of activity. Identify the assessments that are out there. You have a toolkit that lists a lot of different options, and then think about what's important to you. What are the factors that matter for you? And make a chart just like this. And then you can start to assess which tool makes most sense for my jurisdiction, for my court, for the population that I'm serving, for the resources that we have. Right? There's no magic answer, and if anyone says, this is it, they're lying to you. But get the information and then make the decisions that make most sense for your jurisdiction. I want to talk for a minute about validity. So, and I'll wrap up in just a few minutes for questions. The LSIR, the ORAS, the COMPASS, they've all been validated across subgroups, right? They've all been found to be valid across age, race, and gender. But what I'm going to suggest to you is that with any assessment that you adopt, it's incredibly important that you validate it and norm it to your population, that you check to see that it's predicting recidivism the way it's intended to, and that the cutoff points are sensitive to who you're serving. And just briefly, because I've been rambling on, even though these instruments are found to be valid, I'm not sure they're always sensitive enough. And so, for example, in New York, I did a recent analysis of 17 to 24-year-olds in their risk level. And what I found is that close to 90% of 17 to 24-year-olds on probation in New York City were assessed as low to low moderate risk. They skewed incredibly low risk. It was valid. People scoring lower risk recidivated less than people scoring higher risk. But they were so bunched up at the low end that it's not really meaningful for making decisions. And so you want to make sure that you're cognizant of who are you serving, and does this instrument or any instrument that you're using actually operate in a way that's sensitive to that population. If you're serving women, predominantly women, you should think about using a gender-specific instrument, perhaps in addition to or in lieu of a general gender-neutral instrument. There's the Women's Risk-Need Assessment, right, that looks at some additional issues, can give you some additional information about their needs. And if you're serving a population, I have race here, I would also talk about poverty, right? Think about the role of police practice and how that relates to static risk. So if we think about New York City and stop and frisk, right? There were neighborhoods, poor neighborhoods, black neighborhoods that were heavily policed, that people were getting picked up a lot for minor things. And that adds to their static risk. Every arrest adds to their static risk. And a recent study, one of my doctoral students is finishing it up, found police practice didn't predict recidivism, but it did predict risk level. And so you just need to be mindful of who you're working with, who you're assessing, what the special issues are that's happening with your population. I'm not going to tell you to throw these instruments out because these instruments are still the best that we have, but I think you need to be attentive to how they operate within your specific jurisdiction and whether or not they're really giving you accurate measures of risk, right? So just being honest about it so that we can make good decisions. I've sort of talked about all these, so I'm going to jump through this. Final point I want to make is that it's really important to think about implementation, right? I've worked with one agency. I trained them on a juvenile risk need assessment 3 years ago. We're now going through a second round of training because they never actually implemented it, right? It sort of all fell apart. Now they have a strong process in place. They have a training plan in place. They've gotten staff buy-in. They have QA mechanisms in place. If you seek to adopt and implement risk assessments, don't just jump into it, but be methodical in how you're doing it. Because it does take a lot of time and it does take a lot of resources, and you don't want to make decisions kind of ad hoc and then realize that you've adopted something that doesn't work for you or doesn't make sense for you or doesn't give you the information that you need. So finally, as we think about community courts, as we think about how to improve the services, really consider how a risk-need-responsivity approach can help to improve the services you're providing. R&R alone is not enough, right? You're not operating in a vacuum, and I know that. But when you think about who you're serving, the types of services that you're providing, and how you're doing that, R&R can offer a lot of guidance. And if you use this as your framework, this is kind of your foundational piece, you should be successful at reducing recidivism. So that's all I have. And I think we have a little bit of time for questions. Thank you.
We have one back here, Debbie.
Hi. So if I understood what you were saying correctly, if your program focuses on treating the non-criminogenic needs, the effectiveness goes down. And if a mental health in and of itself is not a criminogenic need, then in a mental health court setting, could focusing on mental health as the primary intervention without actually focusing on the other criminogenic needs not be effective? And then part two is, if it does focus on the criminogenic needs, but that focus is almost secondary because it's a mental health court, does that actually decrease the likelihood of positive outcomes?
Yeah, so I think a couple of things. And yes, you understood what I was saying. One is it's talking about how we define effectiveness. And so when I talk about effectiveness, I'm specifically talking about decreasing recidivism, right? And we know there are other ways to measure effectiveness, right? We can think about general functioning, we can think about community engagement. So my focus is specifically on reducing recidivism. With mental health courts, and I think in some ways much like drug courts, that a singular focus often will fall short. So with a mental health court, we absolutely need to be addressing their mental health needs. We need people stable, we need them functioning. But if that's all we do, and again, assuming that you're targeting moderate to high risk individuals, if all we do is stabilize their mental health, it's not likely to have as great of an effect on their criminal behavior. So we need to do both. I think depending on the population that you serve, you maybe focus on mental health first and then bring in the criminogenic needs. I think the danger is that we often forget about the criminogenic needs, right? So if our outcome, if our goal is to stabilize, then maybe the criminogenic needs is less important for your court. But I think ultimately we want both stability and reductions in recidivism.
We have another question over here in the back corner. Over here, your left. I mean, your right.
Okay. I heard the voice.
Good afternoon. You mentioned the benefit to separating genders in treatment. Is that for treatment only, or is there a benefit to separating dockets? And if so, are you aware of any courts that have a women's justice docket or some other segregated docket in that manner? Thanks.
Yeah, great question. I don't know of any research looking at that issue. I'm not sure that I would necessarily advocate for the need to separate dockets. I think there are reasons, and one of the reasons we tend to put men and women together is because that's what reality is, right? That we're not walking around in bubbles. And so I think that's an opportunity that can address that issue. But I think when you're talking about your interventions, your treatment groups, it's critical that we have single-sex groups. But I wouldn't worry about dockets. Yeah.
Hi. So for the risk and needs assessments that we're talking about here, these are statistical measures that end up outputting some kind of a recommendation or statement about the person's risk. And these, most of the time, are built from like proximal measures that we hope and sometimes aren't predictive. And they're also cousins to risk assessments that are the difference between someone getting a 10-year sentence versus a 20-year sentence. And at some level, there's an opaque disconnect between a client answering a question about something and then suddenly having that impact what happens to them. And as you're talking about being very concerned about exacting appropriateness for a level of care out of these sorts of measures, can you say anything about alternatives to just trusting a statistical measure? An idea that's occurring to me is something like a model that doesn't necessarily have a jury, but some kind of a committee of experts that can make a recommendation.
So I want to make sure I'm understanding correctly. There was a lot in there. First of all, I think we need to be careful about using risk assessment to determine sentencing. Mm-hmm. Right? I don't think people are advocating for that. I think there are times that I do sort of wish like we need to be more thoughtful. Well, all the time I'm thinking we need to be more thoughtful about who we send to prison. But I don't see that risk assessment specifically is being used to determine sentencing.
I believe in Colorado, the LSIR actually is used in court evidence as one example. But
it should be as one piece, right? And the same in New York. Risk assessment results are being used as part of a recommendation package, but it's one piece of information. Right. And I think more generally, it's important to note that any of these assessment tools, they're tools, right? They're not meant to take over human judgment. They're intended to add to human judgment, that it's about using the best information we have to make the best decisions that we can, and that these tools tend to give us better information than our individual judgments do. So I think it's appropriate that they're a piece of the information. They shouldn't be the only piece. And I'm sorry, I don't think I'm answering the other part of your question.
Just thinking about alternatives to, like you said that it can't completely replace the human aspect to determining what a person's level of care should be, but I'm just wondering about recommendations for improving the connection between the human side and the data side.
That's a great question. I wish I was really good at like disruption and innovation and could give you a really cool answer. Oh, yeah. I do think that we as humans need to be aware of our own biases. I think it's important that we train individuals that are doing interviews on implicit bias, that we try to address that and reduce that. I also think, especially if you're working with juveniles, I'm not sure if anyone here is, we really need to think about how the language that we use drives their answers. Right, as you said, we ask a question, we get an answer. We need to think carefully about how our language, our questions, their understanding of what we're asking them, their desire to please, right, especially among low-risk people, and how all of that comes into the information that we receive back. So my default answer is we need to be really careful about training, about having proper processes in place, about being thoughtful, about asking multiple questions around a given item, as opposed to have you ever, yes or no types of things. In terms of where the field is going next, I'm not that good. I wish I were. But for me personally, I'm very much focused on training around issues of implicit bias and training around issues of language, particularly with juveniles.
Thank you.
Other questions? We have about 5 more minutes.
Thank you, and it's a very impressive presentation and some very interesting material that came out of it. One aspect that I'm interested in is your notion of recidivism, because it just looks at recidivism broadly and doesn't look at the other, I think, significant component in recidivism, and that is the decrease in the level of reoffending. That is, that you can have an offender who's been committing serious offences for 20 years, but then goes on to only offend in minor cases. But that's really not kind of taken up in the data that you have. It's once you reoffend, you're a recidivist. And I just wondered if there was any added level of sophistication that you had in your research to draw out that different way of analysing recidivism.
Yeah, so, we do generally define as a field, we generally define recidivism as rearrest, right? And we can discuss whether it's rearrest or conviction, reincarceration, but we do tend to use kind of this dichotomous measure. Certainly there are other ways to think about this, which is the level of offense, the severity of the offense, the time to the offense, right? And so some of my colleagues will definitely, and I have a few times, use what we call a time series analysis, right? So how long are we delaying the time to reoffending? And I think we could argue that that's a success, right? If now it's taking 3 years versus 1 year, that's good news, right? Because we've kept them in the community longer. Unfortunately, with many of the meta-analysis, well, with all of the meta-analyses, we're dependent on other people's definitions. And so the definition that becomes common across many of the studies is this dichotomous, yes, no, they did it or not. But I think your point is well taken, and really speaks in part to this debate between recidivism versus desistance, right? And that desistance is a process that occurs over time. I don't know, aside from the time series analyses, I'm not sure that we're doing a good job, or that we've done a good job of kind of measuring that change in offending. But it's certainly, I think, something that more and more people are talking about. I think, unfortunately, the other reality is that if someone's rearrested, that's a strike against us, even if it's for a lower level offense. And so I think both as researchers, but also, in the field, we need to think about the role of desistance and how we can look at that more closely. Yeah, great question. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Debbie, for this wonderful presentation. It's a lot of great food for thought as we move into lunch.